Good afternoon, and in some cases, good morning. I'm Trudy Murata, volunteer community ambassador with AARP here in Northern Virginia. And from our earliest beginnings, AARP has championed lifelong learning. That's why AARP Virginia is thrilled to bring you our third year of Tuesday Explores, a lifelong learning program offered every Tuesday from January through the end of May at 3 o'clock Eastern Time for our curious explorers. For more than 60 years, AARP has been a wise friend and a fierce defender, helping individuals to ensure that their money, health, and happiness live as long as they do. And AARP has earned this reputation as friend and defender through trusted information, tools, and advocacy designed to protect the health and financial security of older Americans and empower them to choose how they live as they age. By promising to continue to act as this friend and defender, AARP is helping people who are 50 plus and their families feel confident, in control, and secure as they age. And as this friend in your corner, AARP helps you protect yourself and your loved ones from frauds and scams through our Fraud Watch Network program. Get healthy and stay healthy, care for loved ones, make connections, plan a trip, learn new technologies, attend a class, and have fun, like what we've been doing every Tuesday here with our Tuesday Explorer program. So I hope you'll continue to take advantage of these opportunities and more. For those of you who have been frequent flyers with our Tuesday program, you may recognize our speaker today, Blane Ampthor. Blane has spoken with us several times on the Tuesday Explorer program, and we're delighted to have him with us always, but always again today. Blane is a retired federal government employee, a Philadelphia native, and has a lifelong interest in history, particularly World War II, ocean liners, and the American Revolutions. And he enjoys visiting all these sites that are related to these subjects and learn about them in more detail. And with that, I will turn the program and the platform over to Blane. Blane, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Trudy. Thank you for that introduction. And as Trudy said, my name is Blane Ampthor, and just as a little background here on the talk today is just kind of how this whole topic came to be is that over the years, visiting Arlington Cemetery for various reasons, became interested in some of the stories that might be there because you see some headstones, sometimes several of the same names are next to each other, and you look at the dates and you think, well, that might be a family members. But also the reading I've done of history over the, several decades, I noticed some of the same people pop up in these stories or in different books. So then I got to looking as to who was buried in Arlington Cemetery. And so since it's close by to where I live, it's easy for me to visit. So um, the stories I'll tell you are just a handful of what I consider some truly astounding feats and extraordinary stories, as well as some fascinating aspects of the heroes who are buried there. And these people often went on to additional achievements in their military life, their civilian life, or some of them simply returned to a humble private life. And though you may recognize some names, most of them will likely be new to you. And that's on purpose because I wanted to highlight people who most people are not familiar with, but who did extraordinary things. When I was visiting the cemetery on one of many occasions to track down the locations of those buried there, I just happened to pass a headstone that had an inscription on it, which I thought was perfect for this presentation. And that inscription is, each headstone represents a story to be told and a past to be remembered. Now, as you can see from this photo, some of my visits occurred during beautiful spring days at the cemetery. So you can see it's what that looks like in the spring when things are in bloom. Now, as I describe these people, I will have a photo of their headstone just so you can see what that looks like, but also for those buried in the columbarium, well, I have a photo of their niche inscription marker. So to begin, we'll start with William and Elizabeth Friedman, who were husband and wife pioneers in the field of U.S. code breaking and cryptology. William had a degree in genetics, while Elizabeth had earned her degree in English. And both worked at the place called the Riverbank Laboratory in Geneva, Illinois, which was a research institute established by a man named George Fabian, who had inherited a large amount of money from his parents' business. And he was kind of a slightly eccentric, I guess you would say, but he had hired William first and then had recruited Elizabeth to work for both of them to work at this laboratory. And so the two of them, William and Elizabeth, met there and were married there, as you can see in this photo on the top right, when they were young. Now, both of them eventually ended up working in the cipher department at this Riverbank laboratory, which was at that time the only cryptologic laboratory in the United States. Now, during World War I, they developed courses in cryptology and trained U.S. Army and Navy officers, as well as some civilians. And on the lower left here, you can see William in his World War I uniform. Now, after World War I, the Army hired William as its main cryptographer, which is when he coined the phrases or the terms cryptanalysis and cryptology. And his significant contribution is that he introduced mathematical methods to this field of code work and cryptology and produced training materials for generations of students. So you could say he wrote the book on the topic. And then he also contributed to the development of cryptologic machines to not only break codes, but to make codes. And during World War II, he worked for the Army's Signals Intelligence Service. And you see on the lower left here, William in his World War II uniform. And when the National Security Agency was established in 1947 after World War II, William was named Special Assistant to the Director. Now, interestingly, toward the end of his career, a disagreement between him and NSA over the possession of what had been classified material, but it had been declassified, led to the end of his relationship with the National Security Agency. Now, if you take a look at their headstone here, they have an inscription on the bottom, which I've enlarged down below, which reads, "Knowledge is power." So that's obviously related to the cryptologic and code breaking work that they perform. Now, we could talk a little bit about Elizabeth. During the Prohibition era, Elizabeth was responsible for breaking codes used by narcotics and alcohol smugglers, including people such as Al Capone and Joseph Kennedy. Now, as the only woman employee of the Coast Guard, in just 3 years, Elizabeth decrypted a 2-year backlog of messages. So that 2-year backlog of messages totaled 12,000 messages. So she decrypted those in just 3 years by herself. Testifying as an expert witness in 33 court cases, her work resulted in 650 criminal prosecutions. And you see the photo on the left here, Elizabeth leaving their home to go to court for one of these prosecutions. During World War II, Elizabeth uncovered an Axis spy network across South America, discovering the identity, the code name, and the codes used by its ringmaster. An achievement for which the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover took credit. Now, this was an important discovery because it caused Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile to join the Allied side during World War II. So up until that time, they had been not committed to either side. Now, using the mathematical methods they developed, William and Elizabeth produced this work here, the Shakespearean Ciphers Examined. So, which disproved the notion that Sir Francis Bacon was the true author of William Shakespeare's works, and that a code had been hidden in William Shakespeare's works, indicating Sir Francis Bacon was the true author. However, using the methods that William and Elizabeth had developed, they disproved that idea. So it is true that Shakespeare is the actual author of his works. And then they carried their work into their social life or their private life because they created coded dinner party menus and holiday greeting cards for friends. Now, the archive of their work and their library is at the George C. Marshall Foundation in Lexington, Virginia. So some people have asked why it's there. But rather than give it to a government agency, the Friedmans donated it so it would be available for researchers to use. And they donated it under one condition, that the numbering system that William and Elizabeth had applied to their material in their library would be retained. So, given their background that I just described, this numbering system for their collection, you might think was very sophisticated. However, it was very basic. They simply ordered their library by number of acquisition of the work. So the first book that they had was number 1. The second book they had was number 2, and so on. So they didn't even use kind of a common library classification system that you would find in any public library. Now, the Friedmans are remembered at the National Security Agency headquarters when a building with the William and Elizabeth Friedman building was dedicated in 2002. In 2019, a Senate resolution was passed in Elizabeth's honor, and a Coast Guard ship, which is under construction, will be named for her in honor of the work she did for the Coast Guard during the Prohibition era. And also, Elizabeth is the subject of a book and a PBS program titled The Woman Who Smashed Codes. All right, now we move on to two people. And anybody familiar with PowerPoint knows I have too much on this slide, but there's a reason for it. So I've broken a PowerPoint rule. However, we'll start at the top left there with Richard O'Kane. Now, he was a World War II submarine commander who commanded the submarine USS Tang, which you see on the lower left. And he was one of the most successful submarine officers during the war because he completed more successful attacks than any other submarine commander. His submarine would sink more than 30 ships, and O'Kane was awarded the Medal of Honor, 3 Navy Crosses, 3 Silver Stars, and the Legion of Merit. And he perfected the bold tactic of attacking submarines or attacking convoys on the surface rather than from a submerged position. So that was a new idea during the war. Now, his submarine, the Tang, earned a Presidential Unit Citation for rescuing 22 downed airmen on one patrol. And if you look at this photo here, the lower middle, you can see O'Kane standing there with those lucky 22 men that his submarine rescued. Now, unfortunately, Tang was sunk in October 1944 when it was struck by one of its own defective torpedoes. Now, unknown to the U.S., 9 out of 87 men on board had actually survived. They had assumed everyone had perished. And those 9 men became POWs for 10 months. When he was freed, O'Kane weighed just 88 pounds. Now, later, after the war in the 1950s, he commanded the submarine school in New London, Connecticut. The escape of some of Tang's crew was made possible by a device called the Momsen lung. And that name, the Momsen lung, was named for this gentleman right here, Charles Swede Momsen. And even though he had the nickname of Swede, he was actually of Danish descent, but you know how nicknames sometimes come about. So previously, he had lost friends in submarine sinkings, and he was determined to find a way to help rescue crews of sunken submarines. And he was bold because he personally tested his invention, which was essentially an underwater breathing device, which could be used as an emergency escape gear. So you see an example of this Momsen lung on the right being worn by that sailor. Now, in 1939, using a diving bell that Momsen had helped develop, he led the rescue of 33 crewmen from the submarine USS Squalus, which had sunk in somewhat shallow water off the coast of Connecticut. Now, this was the first successful rescue of a submarine crew from a sunken vessel, and you can see a painting of that on the lower right. Now, after the war, he commanded a fleet of 200 Army and Navy ships with Japanese crews. So it's kind of a weird combination, Japanese crews on Army and Navy ships that evacuated the first of nearly 6 million Japanese from Manchuria, Formosa, and various Pacific islands. So I have these 2 men on this slide because his invention, Momsen's invention, enabled several of O'Kane's crew to escape the sinking of the Tang. Okay, so now we move on to some pilots. Now, during the attack on Pearl Harbor, 8 U.S. Army Air Corps fighter pilots got airborne. George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, who you see highlighted here with these arrows at the bottom, who are featured in the movie Tora, Tora, Tora about the attack on Pearl Harbor. And you see a poster from that movie on the lower left. Both these pilots, Welch and Taylor, had spent Saturday evening, so the night before the attack, at a dance, followed by an all-night card game at a location away from their base. Now, when the attack began Sunday morning, they phoned the airfield to have their fighter planes made ready. Then they jumped into Taylor's car and drove as fast as 100 miles per hour to reach the airfield and their aircraft. Now, since they were out all night, they were still wearing their tuxedo pants. And they took off wearing them and engaged the enemy. Now, both of them returned to their airfield to have their aircraft rearmed and refueled. But during the initial flight, Taylor had been wounded in the arm and the leg, but took off again without his wounds being treated. So in the end, Welch here shot down 4 airplanes during the attack on Pearl Harbor, and Taylor shot down 2. Both pilots were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Now, Welch here was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but it was denied since his commanding officer said he had taken off without orders. Now, later on, George Welch flew more than 350 missions in the Pacific Theater and shot down 12 more aircraft before returning to the US to train new pilots. Now, unfortunately, in 1954, he was killed while testing the F-100 Super Sabre jet fighter. And like Welch, Taylor here continued to serve in the Pacific Theater, and after World War II was a commander in the Alaska Air National Guard, retiring as a brigadier general. So his case is an example of what I mentioned at the start, where sometimes these people went on to kind of a very plain or humble civilian life, because in civilian life, Taylor worked as an insurance underwriter. Now, the third person I've highlighted here in this photo, Philip Rasmussen, became known as the pajama pilot because when the attack on Pearl Harbor began, he hurriedly left his house still wearing a pair of purple pajamas. Now, in these pajamas, Rasmussen took off and joined 3 other pilots in a dogfight against 11 Japanese aircraft, and he shot down one and damaged another. And when he landed his airplane, it had 500 bullet holes in it. The canopy had been blown off, but he managed to land it with no brakes or a tail wheel. Now, Rasmussen was awarded the Silver Star for his bravery and served another 24 years in the military. And if you look on the lower right here, at the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, there is a display to Rasmussen, the pajama pilot, and they have a mannequin here dressed in pajamas climbing into the aircraft at the start of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And I'll just note here that in the middle, Kenneth Taylor's burial site is what the columbarium niche marker looks like. And you'll see some more of those later. Now, Grace Hopper, she was a trailblazing developer of computers and computer languages. She earned a PhD in mathematics from Yale University, then taught at Vassar College. Now, during World War II, she resigned her position at Vassar College to join the Navy Waves, and the Waves stood for Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service. Now, she, even though when she first enlisted, she was initially rejected because she did not meet the weight or height requirements, so she was a very slight person. However, she was eventually commissioned as a lieutenant and was assigned to something called the Bureau of Ordnance Computation Project at Harvard University. So that's a long description of a computer project that was based at Harvard. And if you look here on the left, you can see her when she was in the service during World War II. So her team at Harvard produced the Mark I, which was an early prototype of the electronic computer. Now, while working on this Mark I project, the word bug was coined to describe a computer malfunction. And this came about when a moth was found stuck in a relay. So you can actually see the record here from that event and the moth that's taped to the record. Okay, so I always wonder where the term bug came from. Well, why did they call it that? But this is where it originated. Now, later, Hopper wrote a 500-page manual of operations, which outlined the fundamental operating principles of computing machines, as they were called back then. And she also helped create UNIVAC, which was the first all-electronic digital computer rather than an analog computer, which was actually turned out to be critical for Apollo space mission communications. And she also co-developed COBOL, one of the earliest standardized computer languages, which enabled computers to respond to words in addition to numbers. And you see her here working on one of those projects on the right. And she predicted that computers would one day be small enough to fit on a desk and that ordinary people would use them in their everyday life. Now, after World War II, she was in the Naval Reserves, but she was recalled to active duty in 1967 as Director of Navy Programming Languages Group. She was promoted several times and eventually reached the rank of Rear Admiral, retiring at age 79, the oldest serving officer, male or female, in the U.S. Armed Forces. And you see her here later in life. Now, describing teaching as her greatest joy, Hopper gave up to 300 lectures per year. And she earned a couple of nicknames. She was known as Amazing Grace and the First Lady of Software. Hopper was awarded the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the highest decoration given to those who did not participate in combat, and she was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. All right, so we move on to Bill Mauldin. Now, he is best known for his World War II cartoons featuring the characters Willie and Joe, who represented the average GI. So you can see Mauldin here on the top left, and those two characters on the bottom, Willie and Joe. Now, Mauldin had studied cartooning at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. After enlisting in the Army, he began cartoon work for the division he was in, later working for Stars and Stripes, the Armed Services newspaper. Now, Mauldin served in Italy, southern France, and Belgium. And even though he parodied the Army, the War Office supported his work since it publicized the ground forces, which at times were not very glamorous, and showed that victory during the war would be difficult. And General Dwight Eisenhower supported the cartoons as an outlet of soldiers' frustrations. Mauldin was a hero to the average soldier since he understood their situation, endured the same conditions, and helped get them through the war. And the character of Willie was featured on the cover of Time magazine in 1945. And you see that cover on the bottom. Now, he won his first Pulitzer Prize for his wartime work, which was later compiled into a book with the title Up Front. And after the war, he focused on political cartoons. Mauldin won a second Pulitzer Prize for his depiction of Soviet author Boris Pasternak in a gulag. And you can see that cartoon here with the caption below, which reads, "I won the Nobel Prize for Literature. What was your crime?" Now, one of his most famous works is a portrait of the Lincoln Memorial after the assassination of President Kennedy, and you see that on the right. Now, the author of the Peanuts comic strip, Charles Schulz, who was a fellow World War II veteran, would pay tribute to Mauldin every Veterans Day in the Peanuts comic strip, and he did so from 1969 to 1998. In 2002, shortly before Mauldin died, a World War II veteran drove 200 miles to visit him. When asked why, the veteran replied, "You have to understand. Mauldin was just a paragon for us. He needed to know he was not forgotten." So that's a nice tribute from a fellow veteran. Now, the 688th Central Postal Directory Battalion, which is known as the 6888, which is much easier to pronounce, was part of the WAC, which was the Women's Army Corps, and the only Black female unit to serve overseas during World War II. led by Major Charity Adams, who you see highlighted here on the top left, the highest ranking and first Black female officer in the U.S. Army in World War II. The unit arrived in England in early 1945 with the task of clearing a 2 to 3 year backlog of mail, a task considered, or the delivery of mail was a task considered vital to morale of the U.S. military. Now, 17 million pieces were cleared by the 688 unit in just 3 months' time, although the Army estimated it would take 6 months to clear that backlog. And this unit achieved this by working 3 8-hour shifts, 7 days a week, which worked out to be about 65,000 pieces of mail per shift. And you can see on the lower left here a photo of just one of the warehouses of backed up mail. So they had quite a task. And on the lower right here, you see them at work sorting some of this mail. And then they later moved to a location in France to do the same job. And this photo was from their work in France. Now, this unit was a little bit different from other military units because it was self-contained, which means that it managed its own supplies, motor pool, personnel, all the actions necessary to run a unit. In 2018, a monument was dedicated in their honor at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and you can see that monument on the top right. And there is a 6888 display at the U.S. Army Women's Museum at Fort Gregg Adams in Virginia. So that's the former Fort Lee, but the Adams part of that name of Gregg Adams is in honor of Charity Adams, the woman who led the unit. Now, in 2019, this unit was awarded the Meritorious Unit Commendation for meritorious service during military operations, as well as the Congressional Gold Medal. Also in 2019, the documentary 6888 was released. Now, there in Arlington National Cemetery, there are 14 women from this unit who are buried there. And the number of women from the 6888 at Arlington was never certain. However, the cemetery cooperated with the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and they figured out that there are 14 women there. So now they know a definite number. Now, 2 of them I'll talk about briefly here. So the first one here is Catherine Bowie, who served in 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And during World War II, she had 3 brothers in the military. And she ended up staying in the Army for 24 years as an administrative specialist and had tours in Okinawa, Germany, and Korea. And then the other woman, Mary Raglan, who you see on the lower right. After the war, she had various civilian jobs. So she kind of seemed to be able to do a little bit of everything because she had various jobs in the Department of Defense, the Army Corps of Engineers, a corporate law firm, UNICEF, and for a brief time was a stage actor in New York. Reflecting on her time in the military, Raglan said, "We wanted to prove ourselves. We represented our country, and we represented our organization and all minorities, and we did a damn good job of it." And there's also a recent release, a documentary on the show, or a movie that's on Netflix. I think it came out in December of last year. And I think it's just called 6888. Okay, so now we move on to Charles Blair, who you see on the top left here. Now, he may be one of the least known but most accomplished aviators. He served in the Navy in the 1930s, and then he flew for United Airlines. during which he pioneered mail routes in the Western US. So during the 1920s, 1930s, delivery of the mail by air was a big deal. Later, he was a chief pilot for American Export Airlines, during which he pioneered new commercial routes to Great Britain, Africa, and South America. So you see him here on this lower photo during that time. As a test pilot for Grumman Aircraft Company, he tested 3 new Navy fighters. And after the war, he commanded the first scheduled flights of the groundbreaking commercial airliners, the Lockheed Constellation and Boeing Stratocruiser aircraft on the transatlantic routes. Now, he was the first person to fly solo over the North Pole. And he did it in this aircraft, which you see on the lower left, which is actually on display at the Udvar-Hazy Air and Space Museum near Dulles Airport in Virginia. And in 1952, he won the Harmon International Aviation Award as the world's outstanding aviator. So quite an accomplishment. Now, while a commercial airline pilot, sometimes he'd be on long flights and he would get bored. So some people might read a magazine or do something else. However, during this time, he was a little bit different. He taught himself celestial navigation. And he used this knowledge to develop an extremely accurate navigation systems for bombers and reconnaissance aircraft before the creation of GPS. And later, he was the founder of Antilles airboats in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And in 1968, he married this lady right here on the lower left, actress Maureen O'Hara. And the two of them were together until 1978, when Blair was killed in an aircraft crash. Now, O'Hara described Blair as the love of her life, and she may best be known or remembered as John Wayne's co-star. You see them together on the lower right. Now, they're both buried together there at Arlington, but you can see, if you can read the headstone there, she's actually buried under her true name, Maureen Fitzsimmons, rather than her stage name of O'Hara. And if you ever get there to the cemetery, their grave is actually fairly easy to find. It's kind of near JFK's grave, so it's just off that path that takes you to that grave. All right, so Robbie Reisner. He's another one that served in 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Now, during the Korean War, he shot down 8 aircraft. And on the return from one engagement that his group had, his wingman's aircraft had been damaged and had run out of fuel. And so if you look on the top right here, you can see a recreation of that. So what Reisner did was he actually put his aircraft right behind his wingman's aircraft and began pushing it. And he pushed it for 30 minutes in order to get his wingman out over the South China Sea, where he could eject from the aircraft and be rescued by the U.S. Navy. So the idea of pushing an aircraft nose to tail had never been done before. Now, Reisner returned to combat in Vietnam and was shot down in September 1965. So he was taken to the Hanoi Hilton, which is actually a kind of a complex of buildings. But he spent 2 weeks in one building and then was transferred to another building that was named the Zoo, where he was interrogated and tortured before being returned to another one of the buildings. And you see him there on the lower left during this time as a POW. Reisner was a prisoner for 7 years, and he spent more than 3 of those years in solitary confinement. Along with the Navy's Captain James Stockdale, Reisner developed a communication code for POWs to talk to each other and led the resistance effort among the prisoners. When the North Vietnamese ordered him to do a propaganda broadcast, Reisner attempted to destroy his voice by injuring his own throat. When that failed, he drank a paste made from soap. Commander Everett Alvarez Jr., who was the first U.S. pilot held as a POW in Southeast Asia, said, "We were lucky to have Reisner. With Captain James Stockdale, we had wisdom. With Reisner, we had spirituality." Now, Reisner was twice awarded the Air Force Cross, once for aerial combat and once for gallantry as a POW. And he was on the cover of Time magazine, which you can see on the lower right. And if you look just to the left of that cover, you see the statue. There's a statue of Reisner on the grounds of the Air Force Academy. Upon Reisner's death, the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Mark Welch, observed, "Brigadier General Robbie Reisner was part of that legendary group who served in 3 wars, built an Air Force, and gave us an enduring example of courage and mission success." Now, Winifred Collins, she was Chief of Naval Personnel for Women in the U.S. Navy and the director of the WAVES, which I'd earlier mentioned stood for Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. As she overcame obstacles during her childhood, at age 11 she contracted polio, but recovered with no effects. And after her parents' divorce, she lived with various relatives in multiple locations and attended high school in 4 different states. Now, she was pretty bright because she received a scholarship to the University of Southern California, and she graduated in 1935 with a degree in business. Now, she began working as a personnel manager of Brunswick Drug Corporation, during which she suggested several changes, such as paying employees according to their performance and the position, regardless of their sex. And due to the positive effects of her suggestions on the company's business, she was sponsored to attend Harvard Business School training, one of the first 5 women to do so. In 1942, Collins joined the U.S. Navy, just 4 days after Congress passed a law allowing women to serve as commissioned officers in the military. And so if you look on the left, you see her at that time during the war. So after joining the Navy, she served as personnel director of the Midshipmen's School at Smith College, which at that time was an all-women's school. And in 1943, she was selected as one of just 12 Navy officers tasked with evaluating the job WAVES could do and the skills they would require to do those jobs. Developing procedures for the 6,000 women officer candidates who reported for duty, Collins continued shaping the Navy's personnel policies for women for the next 20 years. And she helped plan the Women's Armed Forces Integration Act, through which the first female commissioned officers of the U.S. Navy were sworn in, and Collins was one of those who was sworn in. And in 1957, she was appointed Chief of Naval Personnel for Women and promoted to captain, making her the most senior woman in the Navy before she retired in 1962. And before her retirement in 1962, she was invited to the White House, and you can see this photo here of her and President Kennedy. And she wrote a book of her experiences titled More Than a Uniform, which you can see on the right-hand side. Now, Ken Dahlberg, he was drafted into the Army and arrived in England just 4 days before D-Day in 1944. And he became a triple ace, which means shot down 15 enemy aircraft, but he did it flying two different aircraft, the P-51 Mustang, which you see him pictured with here on the top right, and the P-47 Thunderbolt. Now, Dahlberg was shot down 3 times behind enemy lines. He escaped twice and ended the war as a prisoner of war. Now, the first time he was shot down, he bailed out near Paris and was sheltered by the French resistance before being disguised as a woman and riding a bicycle 40 miles to reach Allied lines. Now, after the war, he founded the Miracle Hearing Aid Company, which made the Miracle Ear. So you see on the lower left here his first shop there, and then the Miracle Ear logo. So when I became aware of this, I realized watching TV that Miracle Ear is still regularly advertised. So Dahlberg is the one that invented that. Now, during the Watergate investigation, Dahlberg's name arose. So follow me here. This is a bit of a convoluted story, but Dahlberg was the Midwest finance chairman for the committee to re-elect the president. And he had received an anonymous $25,000 cash donation for the campaign. Now, Dahlberg had a business trip planned going to Florida, and it was in Florida where the person kind of next in the chain of command that he needed to hand over this campaign donation to, it was in Florida where this person was located. So since he had a business trip there, he said, well, I don't want to walk around with $25,000 in cash. So he had the check or the cash converted to a check made out to himself. So when he got to Florida, he handed over the check as he was supposed to do. And so to him, that was the end of it. However, unknown to Dahlberg, that check was deposited into the account of one of the Watergate burglars. So, Washington Post reporter Carl Bernstein learned of this and wrote about it, to which President Nixon is reported to have said, "Who the hell is Ken Dahlberg?" Now, interestingly, during reporter Carl Bernstein's work, he had met with Martin Dardis, who was the head investigator for the Dade County, Florida District Attorney. And he was conducting an investigation into the whole Watergate affair. But interestingly, this Martin Dardis, the district attorney, was one of the soldiers who rescued Dahlberg when he was shot down the second time. So it's funny how these people's paths cross later in life. And in the end, Dahlberg was cleared of any wrongdoing or knowledge related to Watergate. He simply handed over this campaign donation as he was supposed to. And later in life, he was appointed to the Board of Visitors at the Air Force Academy, was a trustee at Hamline University, and was featured on the History Channel's program Dogfights. And later in life, and you can see him down here in the lower right, later in life, but later on, he wrote a book titled One Step Forward, which was an account of his life. And you can see here, he has a very simple marker there, simply has his name, his rank, and the date of birth and death. All right, Samuel Fuqua, even though you see him here in a Navy uniform, served in the Army during World War I before joining the Navy. And his first assignment was on the battleship USS Arizona, and then on various ships until early 1941 when he returned to the Arizona as the damage control officer. During the opening moments of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Fuqua was knocked unconscious by a bomb hit on the rear part of the Arizona. After regaining consciousness, He directed fighting the fires, the rescue of injured personnel, and the escape of some of the crew. Now, after the tremendous explosion on the forward part of the ship, which you can see on the top right here in a famous photograph, Fuqua continued directing treatment and evacuation of the wounded and fighting the fire to keep it from where the injured men had been gathered on the deck. Fuqua later stated, "I saw men on fire burning to death, and they fought the fire until they fell dead at their battle stations. When we picked them up, flesh fell from their hands." And he did all this while the bombing and strafing attacks on the Arizona continued. Arizona crewman Edward Wentzlaff later recalled, "I can still see him standing there, ankle deep in water, stub of a cigar in his mouth, cool and efficient, oblivious to the danger about him." Now, as the senior surviving officer, Fuqua ordered the ship to be abandoned, but remained on board until all personnel had been removed. Now, Arizona burned for 2 days, during which Fuqua helped with attempts to salvage it, and as we know, it was never able to be salvaged. And for his actions that day, he received the Medal of Honor. Now, during the war, he served on the Navy cruiser Tuscaloosa, attended the Naval War College, and helped plan the landings that liberated the Philippine Islands. And again, another example of a very humble civilian life. So after retiring, he received a master's degree in political science, taught mathematics at Fort Union Military Academy in Virginia, and taught civics at St. Petersburg Junior College in Florida. So I like to think if I were a student in one of his classes, and I didn't know who he was at the start of the year, but I found out who he was, I would certainly pay very close attention to him as a teacher. Right. Nama Curtis. She was of Black and Native American heritage, and you see her in a photo here on the top left, which is the only known photo of her to exist. Now, after graduating from California's Snell Seminary for Young Women in 1888 and meeting her husband after she had moved to Philadelphia, the two of them moved to Chicago. And it was in Chicago that she joined a movement to establish a hospital for the treatment of Blacks. In 1898, her husband was appointed superintendent of the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C. So while now living in D.C., the Spanish-American War began, and the Army was not prepared to handle tropical diseases in the areas where the fighting during the war would take place. And in that war, 10 times more people died of disease than combat. Though male corpsmen were used by the Army, they had no nursing training, but the U.S. had been training professional female nurses. So the Surgeon General authorized contract nurses for the Army and selected Curtis to recruit nurses for the military. And you can see here on the right hand a photo of some of those nurses she helped recruit. And though she was not a nurse herself, she was politically connected, well known in social circles, well educated, and knew President McKinley, having campaigned for him. So she was kind of the right person for this job. And in the end, Curtis recruited 32 of the 80 Black contract nurses used during the Spanish-American War. And these nurses were the first to serve in a dedicated quasi-military unit, and they worked 14-hour shifts. And during the war, 153 nurses died of disease. And by the end of the war, the nurses had served in Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Hawaii, and on a hospital ship, as well as in various mainland military hospitals. Curtis continued similar work during the 1900 Galveston, Texas hurricane when she volunteered with the American Red Cross under Clara Barton. And in 1906, she was commissioned by Secretary of War William Taft as part of the relief force for victims of the San Francisco earthquake. And for her work during the Spanish-American War, she was given a lifetime pension. And if you look here at the bottom photo, there is a Spanish-American War Nurses Monument at Arlington National Cemetery. And if you look at her headstone here, that's kind of an older style that's typical for the 1800s. And behind this monument, there's a large section of nurses who are buried together. They're scattered. Nurses are buried throughout the cemetery, but there's one large section of them where there are many well-known and significant people buried there. You know, Don Blakesley actually flew for 3 different countries during World War II. He flew in the Royal Canadian Air Force, Britain's Royal Air Force, and the U.S. Army Air Forces, which later became the U.S. Air Force. Now, Blakesley flew more missions against the German Air Force than any other American fighter pilot. So his story begins when he was younger. He and a friend owned an airplane. However, his friend crashed the airplane. But so as a means to keep flying, Blakesley joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and arrived in England in May of 1941. So this is before the U.S. had entered World War II. So he fought at the end of the Battle of Britain, and you see a painting of him on the lower left here, during that time flying for the Royal Canadian Air Force. And then later, he moved over to the Britain's Royal Air Force in what was called the Eagle Squadrons, which were Americans who had joined the Royal Air Force to help fight Germany during the war. So these were volunteer American pilots fighting for Britain, again, before the U.S. was involved in the war. So now, he's now on his second Air Force. Now, in September 1942, the Eagle Squadrons were integrated into the U.S. Army Air Forces after the U.S. had entered the war. So now he's flying for his third Air Force. And it was during this time that he took command of the 4th Fighter Group. And you often hear the phrase, setting expectations. So when he took command of this 4th Fighter Group, he set expectations by telling his pilots, "We are here to fight. To those who don't believe me, I suggest transferring to another group. I'm going to fly the arse off each one of you. Those who keep up with me, good. Those who don't, I don't want them." So it's pretty clear where he stands. Now, under his command, this 4th Fighter Group became one of the highest scoring fighter units, destroying over 1,000 German aircraft during the war. And even though Blakesley described himself as a poor shot, he was credited with over 15 aerial victories, but historians estimated it was probably closer to 30. And pilots described him as one of the best leaders ever to fight in the air over Germany. And as a combat leader, he would often let other pilots take a shot that he could have taken. And interestingly, he never sought publicity and seldom gave interviews. His aircraft never had a personal name on it or victory crosses painted under the canopy. A fellow pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Turner, wrote of his first impression of Blakesley. He was of medium height and build with wavy brown hair, and pinned you with a penetrating gaze from steel gray eyes, which, if not accompanied by a smile, made one decidedly uncomfortable. He was all business. I've often wondered which scared us most on that first mission, meeting the Germans or displeasing Colonel Blakesley. And you can see his marker here in the columbarium. So the lettering needs to be restored, because when I was tracking down this photo, I knew the location, but I was standing right in front of it, and it was kind of so washed out I didn't see it the first time I stood there. And it was at ground level, but then I had to bend down and see, oh, okay, there it is. So sometimes some of these places are not too obvious to find. Now, Barbara Allen Rainey was the daughter of a career naval officer. And she came from a military family, obviously, but also her brother was a U.S. Marine Corps aviator. Now, Rainey enlisted in the Navy in 1970 and was sent to the Officer Candidate School, after which she sought a greater challenge and was accepted into the U.S. Naval Flight Training School. And in February 1974, Rainey was designated the first female naval aviator. And you can see that marked on her headstone there. And her wings were pinned on her by her father, retired Commander Bill Allen. And you see a photo of that in the lower right. Okay, and anybody who's a parent can appreciate the look of pride on her father's face. Now, when she was pregnant with her first child, she entered the Naval Reserves. But during the time she had her second child, she actually qualified to fly a different type of aircraft, this one right here, the C-118 Navy cargo aircraft. And in 1981, she re-entered active duty as a flight instructor. In 1982, Rainey was killed in an air crash while practicing touch-and-go landings with a student at Middleton Field in Alabama. And she's another person who's actually fairly easy to find. Her headstone is right there along one of the pathways in the cemetery. Now, in 1942, the U.S. Army Air Corps began an experimental training program for Black pilots. Now, this program was located at the Tuskegee Army Airfield near Tuskegee Institute, a historically Black university in Alabama. Now, in 5 years, 966 Black men completed training there. And these men formed the 332nd Fighter Group during World War II that flew more than 1,800 missions, had 112 aerial victories, and was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. Now, Charles McGee, who you see on the top left, was one of these prolific pilots. In 1942, he was studying engineering at the University of Illinois when he entered a training program for Black aircraft mechanics, which in turn led to the pilot program. Now, he also served in Korea and Vietnam, and in the end, he flew more than 400 missions during 3 wars. So you can see him here during World War II on the top left, and a little bit later in his career on the lower left. And he earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Congressional Gold Medal, and in 2020 was promoted to Brigadier General after having retired in 1973. And you see him there on the lower right when he was promoted. Spending much time in schools, speaking to youth, he explained his program for success, which he called the 4 Ps. Perceive your dreams, preparation, performance, and perseverance. McGee was a frequent and eloquent speaker at various events and locations, such as the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. When he died peacefully in 2022, at age 102. His daughter said he had his hand over his heart and was smiling serenely. And there at Arlington, there is a Tuskegee Airman marker and tree to honor the 37 Tuskegee Airmen buried at the cemetery. And you see that marker right here. Okay, so Norman Hatch, he enlisted in the Marine Corps before the start of World War II in 1939 and joined the photographic unit. So you see him there as a young man on the top left. And he filmed the Marine landings and fighting at Tarawa Island in the Pacific Theater in 1943. And this film, which you see on the top right, titled With the Marines at Tarawa, received the 1944 Academy Award for Most Outstanding Documentary Short Film. However, the grisly scenes did not meet Hollywood standards for release to the public. So you can see here on the lower right, typical some of those scenes that were in his film, these dead bodies here, destroyed equipment, things like that. So these scenes did not meet Hollywood standards for release. However, President Roosevelt approved the film's release, which was a risky move that could have backfired. However, showing the brutality of the fighting galvanized continued public support for the war. Now later at Iwo Jima in 1945, when a larger American flag was ordered to be taken to the top of Mount Suribachi to replace the original small flag that was raised there, Norman Hatch there ordered two photographers, Bill Gnaust and Bob Campbell, to join the Marine detachment that was carrying the larger flag up the mountain. Now, on their way up the mountain, these two photographers, Gnaust and Campbell, encountered Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal. Now, Joe Rosenthal knew one of the photographers, Bob Campbell, because they had worked together. So they convinced Rosenthal to join them in their climb up to the top of the mountain. So this chance meeting caused Rosenthal to actually be there at the top of the mountain to take the famous photo, which you see down here on the bottom. So we all know that photo. However, there's also a film of it. And so that film was filmed by Bill Gnaust, who Norman Hatch had sent to the top of the mountain with the Marine detachment. So it was kind of by chance that Rosenthal was there to take the photo, and Gnaust was the person ordered to be sent up there to actually film the event. Now, when Norman Hatch left Iwo Jima, he carried that film that Gnaust had made of the flag raising after Gnaust had been killed later in the fighting. Now, Hatch worked for over 64 years in the film and media industry, and when he died, he was the last Marine associated with the Iwo Jima flag raising. Now, interestingly, several years ago, I sat beside a woman at work who I had known for years, and I just happened to see some program on Norman Hatch the night before, and one of the things that interested me was that he lived nearby in Alexandria, Virginia. And I told her that, and she says, "Oh, that's my uncle." And I said, "No way. This guy is your uncle." And she said, "Yeah, Uncle Norm. He's a real nice guy." So you never know who you're going to meet who knows somebody else. All right, James Jabara. Now, I described some World War II pilots. So those dogfights that took place during that time, they would take place at 300 or 350 miles per hour. However, the military jet age featured dogfighting at 500 miles an hour, a big difference. And so this required a special breed of pilots to identify, implement, and teach new tactics. So James Jabara the son of Lebanese immigrants, was one of these pilots. And you see him on the top left. And as a youth, he had very poor eyesight, but desperately wanted to be a pilot. So he ate 20 carrots a day as a cure. And I suppose it worked. And he ended up serving in 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Now, he was just 5 feet 5 inches tall, but he attributed his success to the discipline he learned working in his father's grocery store, where I guess he got all these carrots, and from becoming an Eagle Scout. And during the Korean War, he shot down 15 airplanes, becoming a triple ace. And on the lower right is the type of aircraft he flew during that war. Now, the youngest colonel in the Air Force, he and his daughter, unfortunately, were killed in an automobile accident in Florida as he was about to deploy to Vietnam. And if you look at the headstone there, you can see they are buried together, James Jabara and his daughter, Carol Ann. Now, the Air Force Academy established the Colonel James Jabara Award for Airmanship in 1967. And this award is presented each year to an Academy graduate whose airmanship contributions are of great significance and set them apart from their contemporaries. So an appropriate award for James Jabara. And if you've ever been to Wichita, Kansas, if you look right down here, the airport there, near where he grew up, was named in his honor, Colonel James Jabara Airport. All right, so we'll wrap up here with Charles Durning, and many of you may recognize him. He's best known for his acting roles in the movies The Sting, which you see on the lower right, and Tootsie, and even the Muppet movie. Now, he was drafted into the U.S. Army at age 20 and was part of the 1st Infantry Division and landed in one of the first waves on Omaha Beach on D-Day. And you see him on the top left there as a young man. Now, he described that experience of landing on Omaha Beach on D-Day when he said, "I was the 2nd man off my barge, and the 1st and 3rd man got killed." He was wounded a few days later and spent 6 months recovering. He was then assigned to the 100th Infantry Division and participated in the Battle of the Bulge. And during that battle, he was one of the few survivors of the Malmedy Massacre when German troops shot American prisoners. And you can see the aftermath of some of that on the top right. In civilian life, Durning participated in various functions to honor American veterans, including serving as chairman of the U.S. National Salute to Hospitalized Veterans. He narrated a Discovery Channel show commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Normandy D-Day landings. And for 17 years, you may remember, he was an honored guest speaker at the annual National Memorial Day concert on the Sunday evening of Memorial Day weekend. And that just took place 2 days ago. So you have heard the stories of just a few of the heroes buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Now, hopefully my retelling of them, you understood that these people displayed many characteristics such as bravery, leadership, endurance, dedication, and honor. And though most of the stories I have described are 70, 80, or even 100 years old, they still astound due to the achievements they tell. General George Patton gave perspective on these people when he said, "When we mourn for such men who have died, we are wrong, because we should thank God that such men were born." Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to attempt to answer them.
Blaine, you've made some changes to this since the last time that I saw you and saw this, and they're remarkable still. So thank you for the time and the energy that you put into doing the research. Which
Sure.
leads me to one question. What advice would you give someone who was interested in doing this type of thing, doing the research and preserving the history behind so many of our national cemeteries and our heroes behind the headstones?
Hmm. Well, there's a lot of resources, I guess, available to do some research. Actually, if you just go to the Arlington National Cemetery website, they have kind of categories of either famous people or interesting stories or groups of people that where they provide some information, but they also often have links to other sources, such as yeah, I mean a very simple one is like find a grave, which often has the obituary of someone or links to other information. Another good resource that I've used are military magazines that are produced. So, either by the branches of the services or kind of military associations often have magazines. There's for the people who've earned the Medal of Honor, there's a Medal of Honor website that tells the story of all the recipients of that award. Um, and there's various efforts to record the stories of anyone who has served. An example is the U.S. Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C. Anybody can submit a record of, a relative or a friend who served in the Navy. And I think they can do it online. So there's all kinds of resources or efforts that are made, including one at the Library of Congress where they try to record these veteran stories. So there's a lot out there.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have lots of comments in the chat box thanking you for a fascinating presentation, and they appreciate the work that you put into finding the stories behind these headstones as well. So with that, I'm going to say, Blane, thank you so much for sharing your afternoon and your expertise
Mhm.
with us. Can't thank you enough, can't express enough gratitude for you for sharing your time and expertise with us. We'd love to get your
You're
feedback on
welcome.
today's program and our Tuesday Explorer program. So there is a link in the chat box that you can click on to let us know what your thoughts are about this. And if you have any ideas for future programs or any ideas as to what I should do with my Tuesday afternoons, we can take those too. As I mentioned, there are lots of other programs, both virtual and in person, at aarp.org/local or aarp.org/VCC, Virtual Community Center, that will keep you busy between now and January. So with that, I will say, Blane, again, thank you so much for your time and your energy putting into this program. Don, thank you for 5 months of technical expertise behind the scenes for doing this. And I'll be looking forward to your suggestions as to what I do with my Tuesdays. And you just never know. You may see me virtually or in person somewhere else when you least expect it. Have a great afternoon. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.